Welcome to Shiver Audiobooks. We're thrilled to have you back with us. They say history is written by the victors, a comforting thought in a world that prefers the light of day. But in the quiet corners of the archives, where the dust of 80 years has settled like a shroud, history has a way of whispering its own version of the truth, a truth that isn't found in headlines, but hidden in a handwritten note, tucked between pages you were never meant to turn. We all believe we are safe in our modern sanctuaries. We trust the silence of our libraries and the solid stone of our universities. But what happens when the very institution designed to protect our knowledge becomes the vault for our darkest sins? What happens when an 80-year-old bank heist isn't just a story from the past, but a countdown for the present? You are about to enter a world of gothic noir and systemic betrayal. A world where Zack Baxter and Hannah Harding are forced to step out of the quiet safety of the reading room and into a deadly crossfire of greed and blood. From the cold, rain-slick streets of Ravenna to the obsidian heart of a basement that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. This is not a story of a simple treasure hunt. This is a story of a long-buried reckoning. Because when a billion-dollar empire has been built on a lie, the only way to save your future is to unearth the past. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that unearth the shadows of the system, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep the signal alive. This is Stay Out.
Chapter 1. The Veil of Dust. The silence of the Ravenna University Library was not a peaceful thing. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, a thick shroud of ancient paper and trapped, stale oxygen that seemed to press against Zack Baxter's lungs with every breath. At 20, Zack was a creature of these shadows. While the rest of the student body was blocks away at the campus bars, drowning their academic stress in cheap beer, Zack was buried in the restricted archives, a subterranean labyrinth that smelled of damp limestone, rotting leather, and the cold breath of forgotten centuries. The archives were located 3 stories beneath the street level, reachable only by a rattling cage elevator that felt like a descent into a tomb. Down here, the hum of the city was replaced by the low, rhythmic thrum of the ventilation system, a sound like the breathing of a giant, sleeping beast. Zack was supposed to be researching his senior thesis on post-war black markets, but his eyes kept drifting toward the uncatalogued section. This was the graveyard of the library, a row of iron shelves where books inherited from estates or seized from closed institutions sat in a state of permanent exile. That was where he saw it. Tucked between 2 crumbling encyclopedias was a ledger. It was bound in a leather so dark and worn it looked like charred skin. It had no call number, no barcode, no sign of ever having been processed by a human hand in the modern era. Just a title embossed in fading, cracked gold leaf, the Ledger of Lost Assets. Zack pulled it out. The vacuum of its removal caused a puff of gray dust to dance in the beam of his flashlight, swirling like tiny ghosts in the dark. As he cracked open the stiff, protesting spine, a small, yellowed slip of paper fluttered out. It didn't fall. It drifted, landing on the cold floor like a dying moth. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The paper was thick, a government-grade vellum that had turned the color of old bone. The handwriting was cramped and frantic, the script of someone whose heart was racing as they wrote. 3 turns for the silver, none for the soul. Where the silent scholars sleep, find the hole. Under the gaze of the man who cannot see, the vault awaits the copper key. Zack's breath hitched. A riddle. Not a joke, not a bookmark, but a riddle. He flipped the ledger to the first page. June 1946. The date hit him like a physical blow. That was the month of the Union National heist, the so-called ghost robbery. Millions in gold had vanished from a high-security vault downtown, and despite 80 years of investigation, not a single coin had ever been recovered. "You shouldn't be down here, Mr. Baxter." The voice was like the scraping of a shovel against gravel. Zack nearly jumped out of his skin, his boots skidding on the stone floor as he spun around. He reflexively shoved the note into his jeans pocket, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Standing at the end of the aisle was Mr. Henderson, the head librarian. He was a man who seemed to be made of the same dust as the books he guarded. His face was a map of deep, parchment-like wrinkles, and his eyes were hidden behind thick, milky spectacles that caught the flashlight's beam, turning them into two glowing white discs. He held a massive ring of iron keys. They didn't jingle, they clanked. "The archives are closing, Mr. Baxter," Henderson said, his head tilting slightly, like a predator catching a scent. "The lights go out in 5 minutes. And the darkness down here, it doesn't like to be disturbed." "I was just leaving," Zack managed to say, his voice cracking. He felt Henderson's gaze, or the sensation of it, burning through those milky lenses, focused directly on the pocket where the note was hidden. "Curiosity is a heavy burden," Henderson whispered, his voice trailing off as he stepped back into the shadows. "Be careful you don't find something you can't put back." Zack didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed his bag and bolted for the elevator. The ride up felt like an eternity, the iron cage groaning as it climbed toward the surface. When the doors finally opened to the main lobby, he burst out into the night. Outside, the Ravenna campus was a world of gray and black. A cold, relentless rain was falling, turning the cobblestones into slick mirrors. He spotted Hannah Harding huddled under the library's massive stone portico. She was a fellow history major, sharp-witted and grounded, the only person Zack trusted with his often wild theories. "You're white as a sheet," Hannah said, closing her umbrella as Zack pulled her into the shadow of a gargoyle-topped pillar. "Did the ghost of a dead monk finally find you?" "Look at this," Zack hissed, pulling out the note. He explained the ledger, the date, and the heist. Hannah studied the paper, her analytical mind already stripping the riddle apart. 1946? "Zack, if this is real, you're talking about the most famous unsolved crime in the city's history. But the man who cannot see? That could be anything." "Not in this library," Zack countered, his eyes bright with a feverish energy. "The West Wing reading room. There's a marble bust of Milton, the blind poet. He's been staring at the same corner for 100 years. That's the starting point." Hannah opened her mouth to argue, to play the skeptic as she always did, but the words died in her throat. Her eyes drifted past Zack's shoulder, toward the street lamp flickering at the edge of the quad. Her face went slack. "Zack," she whispered, "don't turn around. But someone is watching us." Zack didn't listen. He turned. Across the rain-slicked road, standing perfectly still under the jaundiced light of a lamp, was a man. He wore a long, charcoal-colored overcoat that seemed to absorb the rain rather than get wet. He had no umbrella. He just stood there, his head tilted at an unnatural, bird-like angle. The man stepped forward, and for a terrifying second, the light hit his face. He was pale, with features as sharp and cold as a razor blade. He leaned on a silver-headed cane, and as he adjusted his grip, Zack saw it, a jagged, white scar that ran like a lightning bolt across his hand palm. This was Ronan Hawke. Hawke didn't move toward them. He didn't shout. He simply raised a gloved finger to his lips, a silent, chilling command to stay quiet. Then, with a fluid grace that was almost ghostly, he stepped backward into the darkness of the elm trees and was gone. "We have to go," Zack said, his voice trembling. He grabbed Hannah's hand. His fingers were like ice. He wasn't waiting for the library to close, Hannah. He was waiting for someone to find that note. And he's been waiting a long, long TYD. The hunt had begun. But as they hurried away into the mist, the heavy oak doors of the library groaned shut behind them, sounding uncomfortably like the lid of a casket being nailed into place. Chapter 2: The Blind Poet's Eyes. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a violent downpour by the time Zack and Hannah reached the safety of a small, 24-hour diner 3 blocks from the campus. They sat in a corner booth, the smell of burnt coffee and grease providing a hollow comfort against the freezing dread that had followed them from the library. Zack placed the yellowed slip of paper on the Formica table. Under the harsh neon lights, the handwriting looked even more desperate. "Ronan Hawke," Hannah whispered, staring at her reflection in the dark window. "That man, he didn't look like a student, Zack. He looked like a predator. Did you see his eyes? They didn't even blink when the rain hit them. "He's not a student," Zack said, his voice low. He was frantically typing on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. "I've seen that scar before. Not in person, but in the archives." There was a photo from the 1980s, a cold case file regarding the Union National heist. A man named Silas Hawke was the prime suspect. He died in prison, but he had a son, Ronan. Hannah shivered, pulling her damp cardigan tighter. "So this isn't just a history project. This is a family vendetta. Zack, if he's been waiting for that note, he's not going to let us just walk away with it. We should go to the police." "And tell them what?" Zack countered, leaning forward. "That we found a riddle in a book? They'll laugh us out of the station. Besides, look at the second line. Where the silent scholars sleep, find the hole." It's not just about the gold anymore, Hannah. It's about the fact that it's been under our feet this whole time. In our library. "The silent scholars," Hannah murmured, her academic brain finally overriding her fear. "The West Wing. That's where the statues of the great philosophers are. And the bust of Milton." "Exactly," Zack said. "John Milton, the blind poet. Under the gaze of the man who cannot see. We have to go back. Tonight." "Are you insane? Henderson is there. And he is out there." She pointed toward the dark street. "Henderson leaves at midnight. The night shift security guard, Arthur, is 80 years old and spends 4 hours of his shift asleep in the break room. If we don't go now, Hawke will find a way in. He's probably watching the building right now, waiting for us to lead him to the next step." It took another 20 minutes of arguing, but Zack's obsession was infectious. By 1:15 a.m., they were standing at the side entrance of the Ravenna University Library. The massive Gothic building loomed over them like a gargantuan stone beast, its windows dark and hollow. Zack used a plastic shim, a trick he'd learned during his rebellious teenage years, to bypass the latch on a ground-floor window that he knew didn't lock properly. They slipped inside, the air suddenly turning still and smelling of floor wax and old dust. The West Wing was a cathedral of knowledge. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into the darkness above, and rows of mahogany tables stretched out like altars. Their flashlights cut narrow paths through the gloom. "There he is," Zack whispered. The marble bust of John Milton sat on a pedestal of green malachite. The poet's sightless eyes were turned slightly downward, fixed on a specific patch of oak flooring near the base of a towering bookshelf. Hannah knelt, her flashlight scanning the floorboards. "There's nothing here, Zack. It's just wood." Zack didn't answer. He was counting. 3 turns for the silver, none for the soul. He looked at the bookshelf Milton was gazing at. It was filled with heavy volumes of 19th century theology. He reached for the 3rd shelf. "Zack, wait." He gripped the side of the shelf and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of rusted metal that sounded like a scream in the silent hall, the entire section of the wall pivoted. It didn't open wide. It just shifted 3 inches, revealing a dark, vertical void. The hole where the scholars slept. "It's a hollow pilaster," Hannah whispered, her eyes wide. Zack reached into the gap. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a small, heavy box made of tarnished silver. There was no lock, just a sliding lid. Inside, resting on a bed of rotting velvet, was another note. But this one was different. The paper was newer, the ink dark and wet-looking. "You are faster than your father, Mr. Baxter. But the graveyard holds the truth that the books hide. Go to the Weeping Angel. If you aren't there by dawn, your friend won't need the copper key. She'll need a coffin." A cold sweat broke out on Zack's neck. This wasn't the original 80-year-old riddle. "Zack." Hannah's voice was a terrified whimper. He turned his flashlight toward the far end of the hall. Standing by the exit, framed by the shadows of the towering bookshelves, was Ronan Hawke. He wasn't leaning on his cane anymore. He held it like a weapon. The silver head of the cane caught the light, and for the first time, Zack saw Hawke's face clearly. He was smiling, but his eyes were as dead as the marble statues surrounding them. "The silver box was never for me." Hawke's voice echoed through the hall, smooth and terrifyingly calm. It was the bell to let me know the rat had found the cheese. You've done well, Zack. But the graveyard is a lonely place at night. Shall we? From the shadows behind Hawke, a second figure emerged. It was Mr. Henderson, the librarian. But he wasn't wearing his spectacles. His eyes weren't milky at all. They were sharp, blue, and filled with a cold, corporate greed. "The note, boy," Henderson said, extending a withered hand. "Give us the location of the angel, or Miss Harding here becomes a permanent resident of the archives." Zack looked at Hannah, then at the silver box in his hand. He realized then that the 80-year-old mystery wasn't a dead story. It was a living, breathing trap. Chapter 3. The Weeping Angel's Tears. The air in the West Wing grew thin, the atmosphere vibrating with the unspoken threat of Ronan Hawke and the betrayal of Mr. Henderson. Zack felt the weight of the silver box in his palm, a cold, metallic anchor in a world that had suddenly drifted into a nightmare. "The graveyard," Zack whispered, his voice cracking. "You knew. You've known all along, haven't you, Henderson?" The old librarian stepped into the weak circle of Zack's flashlight. Without his glasses, his face lost its frailty. He looked like a wolf in a scholar's robes. "I've spent 40 years guarding this dust, Mr. Baxter. I've watched 3 generations of your kind come and go, but none of them had the intuition that you possess. You found in one night what Ronan's father couldn't find in a lifetime." "My father was a man of brute force," Ronan Hawke said, his voice gliding through the darkness like a blade. He began to walk toward them, the rhythmic thud-click of his cane echoing against the vaulted ceiling. He looked for vaults with TNT and drills. He didn't understand that the men who stole that gold were men of letters. They were architects of riddles. Hawke stopped 10 feet away. The jagged scar on his hand glistened. "The note, Zack. Read the rest." Zack looked down at the fresh ink on the paper. The Weeping Angel. He knew exactly where that was. Ravenna Old Cemetery sat on the edge of the city, a sprawling, Gothic ruin of a graveyard where the elite of the 19th century lay in crumbling mausoleums. The Weeping Angel was the largest monument there, a 6-foot statue of Carrara marble that was said to turn gray when it rained. "We aren't going anywhere with you," Hannah said, her voice trembling but defiant. She stepped closer to Zack, her hand gripping his sleeve so hard her knuckles were white. "On the contrary, Miss Harding," Hawke said, reaching into the inner pocket of his charcoal coat. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a small, handheld detonator. "The archives beneath us are filled with 80 years of nitrate film and dry parchment. A single spark, and this entire history, including the 2 of you, becomes ash. I don't need the gold tonight. I have patience. But do you have the breath to survive a fire?" Zack felt a surge of protective rage, but the sight of the detonator froze him. He looked at Hannah, seeing the sheer terror in her eyes. He couldn't let her die in a basement. "Fine," Zack said, his voice steadying. "We go to the cemetery. But Hannah stays in the car. She has nothing to do with this." Hawke's thin lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his dead eyes. "Agreed. For now." The drive to the cemetery was a blur of rain and neon. They were forced into Hawke's black sedan, a vehicle that smelled of expensive leather and old ozone. Henderson drove with a terrifying, mechanical precision, while Hawke sat in the front, staring at the road as if he could see through the dark. Zack and Hannah sat in the back, their hands locked together, a silent pact of survival. They reached the iron gates of Ravenna Old Cemetery at 2:45 a.m. The fog had rolled in from the nearby river, thick and yellow, swallowing the headstones until only the tallest obelisks poked through like the fingers of drowning men. "Out," Hawke commanded. The ground was a slurry of mud and dead leaves. They hiked in silence, the only sound the wind whistling through the headless statues and the rhythmic clack of Hawke's cane. Finally, they reached it. The Weeping Angel. The statue was haunting. The angel was bent over a stone sarcophagus, her face buried in her hands, her wings spread wide. In the moonlight, the streaks of mineral deposits on her cheeks looked exactly like tears of soot. Look for the mark, Hawke hissed, his composure finally cracking. The greed was visible now, a frantic, starving thing in his eyes. Zack approached the base of the statue. He remembered the first riddle, where the silent scholars sleep, find the hole. But this was a different place. He looked at the angel's feet. There, carved into the granite plinth, was a tiny, weathered symbol, a key with a broken bow. It's not a hole, Zack whispered, realization dawning on him. It's a compass. He looked at where the angel's shadow fell under the light of Hawke's high-powered lantern. The shadow pointed toward a collapsed iron gate leading to a lower tier of the cemetery, the paupers' graves. Under the shadow, Zack said. They moved to the spot. Among the overgrown weeds and shattered slate markers was a flat, unremarkable stone. It bore no name, only a date, October 14th, 1946. Dig, Henderson said, tossing a folding shovel at Zack's feet. Zack dug. The earth was heavy and smelled of iron. After 3 feet, the shovel hit something hard. Not wood. Metal. He cleared the mud with his hands, his fingernails bleeding. It was a heavy, cast-iron lid with a rusted ring handle. With a grunt of effort, Zack pulled. The seal broke with a wet, sucking sound. Inside wasn't gold. It was a skeleton, dressed in the rotted remains of a 1940s security guard uniform. In its bony fingers, it clutched a leather satchel. And pinned to the satchel was the final riddle, written on a piece of copper plating. Zack picked up the copper plate. His flashlight flickered. The gold is not for the living, nor for the dead. It is for those who return to where they started. The basement holds the weight, but the heart holds the key. Return to the book, or stay buried with me. It's a loop, Hannah whispered, staring at the skeleton. The gold isn't here. It's back at the library. It was never moved. The book, Hawke breathed, his face contorted in a mask of triumph. The ledger. The key is in the binding. But as Hawke reached down to grab the copper plate from Zack's hand, a low, guttural growl echoed from the fog. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of a heavy engine. Suddenly, bright blue and red lights cut through the yellow mist. The police? No. These were unmarked black SUVs, swerving through the cemetery paths with terrifying speed. Who was that? Henderson screamed, drawing a pistol from his coat. Hawke's face went pale. The bank, he whispered. They never closed the file. They've been waiting for us to find it. Run, Zack yelled, grabbing Hannah's hand. They dived behind the weeping angel just as the first shot rang out, a sharp crack that shattered the marble wing of the statue above their heads. The cemetery was no longer a place of rest. It had become a killing field. Chapter 4. The Silence of the Grave. The muzzle flashes were the only thing cutting through the yellow fog of the Ravenna Old Cemetery. Each crack of gunfire felt like a physical blow against the air. Zack and Hannah were pressed so tightly against the freezing marble of the weeping angel that Zack could feel the vibration of the stone as bullets chipped away at the statue's wings above them. They're not stopping, Hannah screamed over the roar of an engine. The black SUV was a shadow beast, its tires grinding over the graves of the forgotten, its high beams turning the mist into an impenetrable wall of white light. This wasn't a police intervention. This was an execution. Across the mud-slicked clearing, Mr. Henderson was a man transformed by greed. He stood near the open grave of the security guard, firing his pistol into the dark, his face contorted in a mask of madness. "It's mine," he shrieked. 40 years in that basement. I earned this. But Ronan Hawke was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished into the fog the moment the first SUV appeared. Zack knew he wasn't gone. Hawke was a ghost, and ghosts don't leave until they have what they came for. The canal wall. Zack yelled, grabbing Hannah's hand. "If we stay here, they'll pin us down." "Move." They sprinted. The ground was a treacherous slurry of mud and rotted leaves. Zack's lungs burned in the cold night air. Behind them, a massive explosion rocked the cemetery. A wall of orange flame erupted near the gates. Hawke had triggered his detonator, turning his own car into a burning barricade to block the SUV's path. They reached the perimeter wall, a 10-foot barrier of jagged Victorian brick. Zack hoisted Hannah up, his muscles screaming. As she reached the top, a hand, cold as a dead man's and strong as iron, clamped around Zack's ankle. He was pulled down into the mud. "The plate, Mr. Baxter," Ronan Hawke hissed. He was hovering over Zack, his face streaked with blood and soot. The silver-headed cane was pressed against Zack's throat. "The bank will kill you for it. I will only kill you if you refuse me." Zack looked up at Hannah on the wall. He looked at the copper plate in his hand. Then, he looked at the headlights of the second SUV swinging toward them. "If I can't have it, nobody can," Zack roared. He didn't hand the plate to Hawke. Instead, he twisted and flung it with all his might over the wall. It vanished into the dark, rushing waters of the Ravenna Canal with a faint plop. No! Hawke's scream was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. For a split second, the predator was broken. Zack used that second to kick Hawke in the chest, scramble up the wall, and tumble down the other side with Hannah into the tall grass of the towpath. 30 minutes later, the silence of the Ravenna University library felt like a trap. They were soaked to the bone, shivering, and covered in the filth of the graveyard. They had slipped through the side window, moving like shadows through the halls they once thought were safe. "The archives," Zack whispered, his teeth chattering. "We have to find the book." They reached the restricted section. The smell of old paper was normally comforting to Zack, but tonight it smelled like a shroud. He grabbed the ledger of lost assets from the shelf. His hands were shaking so hard, he almost dropped it. "The heart holds the key," Hannah murmured, repeating the final riddle. She held the flashlight steady while Zack took his pocketknife to the binding. He sliced through the thick, reinforced leather of the spine. Inside, hidden in a cavity carved into the very heart of the book, was a heavy brass key. It was old, tarnished, and etched with the numbers 0 to 80. "Sublevel D," Zack said. "Under the boiler room." They found the entrance behind a rusted map rack. The door was heavy steel, hidden behind decades of stacked newspapers and discarded journals. When Zack turned the key, the mechanism groaned, a sound that seemed to echo up through the entire building. They descended a narrow, rusted spiral staircase. The air grew warmer, smelling of oil and ancient metal. At the bottom, they entered a small, concrete vault. And there it was. 40 wooden crates, stacked neatly. One had rotted through, and in the beam of Zack's flashlight, the contents glowed with a dull, hypnotic luster. Gold. Millions of dollars in bars, stamped with the seal of the Union National Bank, missing since 1946. "We did it," Hannah breathed, reaching out to touch the cold metal. "Zack, we actually—" "You did indeed," a voice interrupted. It wasn't Hawke. It wasn't Henderson. Standing at the base of the stairs was a woman in a sharp, gray charcoal suit. Behind her stood 4 men in tactical gear, their faces hidden by gas masks, the reds of their laser sights dancing across Zack's chest. "Director Vance," the woman said, her voice devoid of emotion. "On behalf of the Union National Trustees, I thank you for your assistance in locating our lost property. You've solved a riddle that has bothered us for 80 years. "You're the ones from the cemetery," Zack said, his blood turning to ice. "The cleaners." "We prefer asset recovery," Vance said, raising a silenced pistol. "But you are correct. And as any good archivist knows, some records are better off destroyed." "Wait," Zack shouted, holding up the ledger he still carried. "You want the gold, but you don't want the truth. This ledger proves the bank's founders stole the money from their own depositors." Vance didn't blink. "History is written by the survivors, Mr. Baxter. And tonight, you aren't among them." She began to squeeze the trigger. Suddenly, the lights in the vault flickered and died. A heavy, metallic clack-clack-clack echoed from the ventilation shafts. "What is that?" one of the guards hissed. From the darkness above, a voice whispered, a voice Zack recognized with a shiver of terror. "The boy is mine, Vance. You can have the gold, but the riddle belongs to the Hawkes." A smoke grenade clattered onto the concrete floor, hissed, and the vault disappeared into a cloud of white. Chapter 5. The Devil's Bargain. The smoke was thick, acrid, and tasted like sulfur. Within seconds, the golden glow of the bunker vanished, replaced by a blinding white wall of chemicals. Zack lunged for Hannah, grabbing her arm and pulling her down behind the heavy wooden crates of gold. The silence was broken by the frantic coughing of Director Vance's guards and the chaotic sweep of their red laser sights, cutting uselessly through the haze like frantic fireflies. "Don't fire. You'll hit the assets." Vance's voice shrieked, no longer cold, but laced with a sharp, jagged panic.
Clang, clang, clang.
The sound was coming from the ceiling, the old iron ventilation ducts that ran like a nervous system through the library's sublevels. Suddenly, a heavy metal grate crashed to the floor. A silhouette dropped through the smoke, moving with a terrifying, rhythmic grace despite a pronounced limp. "The light, Vance. Use the flares," one of the tactical men shouted. A magnesium flare ignited, casting a harsh, flickering blue light over the vault. Standing between the gold and the gunman was Ronan Hawke. His charcoal coat was charred, his face was a mask of soot and dried blood, and in his hand, he held the silver-headed cane. But it wasn't a cane anymore. He had twisted the head, revealing a long, narrow blade of polished steel. "The boy flings my legacy into a canal, and you try to bury him in a tomb," Hawke said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the floor itself. "Neither of you deserves the secret of Oakhaven." "He's one man," Vance hissed to her guards. "Kill him.
Now."
The silenced pistols coughed, thwip, 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 but Hawke was gone, rolling behind a concrete pillar with the agility of a man half his age. "Zack," Hannah whispered, her lips against his ear. She was trembling, but her eyes were darting toward the back of the vault. "The furnace. The old coal chute. It's behind the crates." Zack looked. Hidden behind the stack of gold was a heavy iron flap, rusted shut for half a century. It led upward, toward the alleyway behind the library. It was their only way out, but it was 20 feet away through a crossfire. "On my signal," Zack breathed. In the center of the room, the battle was a blur of shadows. One of Vance's guards screamed as Hawke's blade found a gap in his tactical vest. The other three turned their fire toward the pillar, lead chewing into the concrete, sending a spray of stone chips into the air. "You think gold is the prize, Vance?" Hawke's voice echoed, seemingly from two places at once. "The gold is just the weight that keeps the truth submerged. My grandfather didn't rob the bank robbed the city, and he took the blame. History doesn't care about the truth." Vance roared, grabbing a submachine gun from her fallen guard. "It only cares about who's left to tell it." She opened fire, a relentless spray of lead that forced Hawke further into the shadows.
Now.
Zack yelled. He and Hannah bolted. They scrambled over the crates, Zack's boots treading on bars of solid gold that would have bought 10 lifetimes of safety, but right now, they were just stepping stones to survival. They reached the iron flap. Zack grabbed the handle. It didn't budge. He pulled again, his muscles straining until his vision blurred. It's rusted shut. A shadow fell over them. Zack spun around, expecting a bullet. Instead, he found himself staring into the pale, frantic eyes of Mr. Henderson. The librarian had crawled down the stairs, his clothes torn, his glasses gone. He looked pathetic, a broken man at the end of a long, dark road. "The key." Henderson wheezed, clutching a bleeding wound in his side. "The brass key. It doesn't just open the door. It unlocks the vent." Henderson reached out, not for Zack, but for the iron flap. He inserted a small, secondary key, one he had kept hidden for 40 years, into a tiny hole Zack hadn't even noticed.
Click.
The flap swung open with a shriek of metal. "Go," Henderson whispered, a strange, hollow smile touching his lips. "I've spent too long in the basement. I think I'll stay with the books." Zack didn't have time to argue. He boosted Hannah into the dark, narrow chute. She scrambled up the soot-covered incline. Zack followed, his fingers clawing at the walls. Below them, the vault erupted. A grenade, Hawke's last gift detonated. The sound was deafening, a roar of fire and gold and 80 years of buried lies. The shockwave shoved Zack upward, tossing him out onto the wet pavement of the alleyway like a piece of discarded trash. He gasped for air, the cold rain hitting his face like a blessing. Hannah was beside him, coughing, her face black with soot. They lay there for a moment, the muffled sounds of sirens approaching from the distance. The library loomed over them, smoke beginning to curl from the basement windows. "Is it over?" Hannah asked, her voice a mere thread. Zack reached into his jacket. He didn't have the gold. He didn't have the copper plate. But he felt the weight of the original bank ledger, the one he'd grabbed from the satchel in the vault before the smoke grenade went off. "No," Zack said, looking at the black book in his hand. "The hunt for the gold is over. But the hunt for the truth? That's just beginning." He looked toward the end of the alley. A man in a torn charcoal coat was standing under a distant street lamp, leaning heavily on a broken cane. Ronan Hawke looked at them for a long, silent moment. He didn't move. He didn't strike. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement between two hunters, and disappeared into the Ravenna fog. Chapter 6. The Paper Trail. The rain had slowed to a miserable, icy mist by the time Zack and Hannah reached the edge of the university district. They were shadows among shadows, their clothes blackened by soot and their skins smelling of cordite and ancient dust. Every distant siren felt like a claw reaching for their necks. Every pair of headlights was a searchlight from Director Vance's private army. They couldn't go to the dorms. They couldn't go to the police. Not when the cleaners likely had the local precinct on their payroll. "The architecture studio," Hannah whispered, her teeth still chattering. "It's in the old tannery building. It's open 24 hours for seniors, but no one goes to the top floor during the week. It's got a scanner, Zack. A high-res industrial scanner." Zack nodded, his hand instinctively clutching the heavy, leather-bound ledger tucked beneath his jacket. It felt like a ticking bomb. They moved through the back alleys of Ravenna, avoiding the main quads where the blue and red lights of fire trucks were now swarming around the library. To the world, it would look like an electrical fire in an aging building. To the Union National Bank, it was a scorched earth policy. The tannery was a bleak, brick monolith on the edge of the canal. They slipped inside using Hannah's keycard, their footsteps echoing on the cold linoleum. The elevator was too risky, so they climbed the 5 flights of stairs in total silence. Once inside the deserted studio, surrounded by half-finished models and drafting tables, Zack finally pulled the ledger out. He placed it on a clean white desk, and for a moment, they both just stared at it. "This is it," Zack said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "The reason Ronan Hawke's family was destroyed. The reason Henderson spent 40 years in a hole." He opened the first page. The ink was different from the riddles. It was formal, precise, and utterly damning. "It wasn't a heist," Hannah whispered, reading over his shoulder as he flipped through the pages. "The gold wasn't stolen by a gang. It was relocated by the bank's own board of directors. Look at these entries, Zack." They used the 1946 robbery as a front to hide the fact that they had embezzled the city's post-war reconstruction funds. The theft allowed them to claim the insurance, while they kept the actual gold in the basement to use as private collateral for their expansion, Zack realized. They built their global empire on a lie. And the Hawks? Ronan's grandfather was the head of security. He was the perfect fall guy. "We need to get this online," Hannah said, reaching for the scanner's power button. "Once it's everywhere, they can't kill it. They can't kill us." But as the scanner warmed up, a low hum, different from the machine, vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a drone. Zack looked toward the window. A small, black quadcopter was hovering just outside the glass, its red record light blinking like a malevolent eye. "They found us," Zack hissed. Vance didn't need a trail. She just needed the GPS in our phones. "I turned mine off," Hannah cried. "The Find My Phone feature is hardwired into the OS, Hannah. If the bank owns the towers, they own us." Zack grabbed the ledger and looked around the room. There was no back exit. Just the stairs and the window. Suddenly, The drone drifted away, but it wasn't a retreat. It was clearing the way.
Crash.
The window exploded inward. 2 canisters of tear gas skittered across the drafting tables, spewing thick, white clouds. Masks, Zack yelled, pulling his shirt over his nose. But it was useless. His eyes began to burn, and his throat felt like it was being scraped with hot glass. Through the fog, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud-click of a cane on the wooden floor. It wasn't Vance. A scanner, Zack? Truly. Ronan Hawke's voice drifted through the gas, sounding strangely clear. He moved through the haze, wearing a vintage gas mask that looked like something out of a trench war. He looked like a demon rising from the fumes. Hawke reached through the smoke and grabbed the ledger from the table. "You flamed my legacy, boy," Hawke said, his voice muffled by the mask but dripping with a dark, paternalistic fury. "I told you the gold is the weight. But this is the light. This is my family's name, written in the blood of the men who betrayed us." "Give it back, Hawke." Zack tried to lunge, but he tripped over a drafting stool, his vision swimming in tears. "If you take it, they'll just kill you too. Vance is right behind you." "Vance is a bureaucrat," Hawke spat. He looked at the ledger, then at the terrified students on the floor. He seemed to hesitate. For 80 years, his family had wanted this book. Now he held it. "The cleaners are in the lobby," Hawke said, his tone suddenly shifting to something cold and pragmatic. "They'll be here in 2 minutes. They won't use gas next time. They'll use lead." He reached into his coat and tossed something at Zack's feet.
A small, silver USB drive.
"I've spent 10 years hacking the bank's internal servers, waiting for the physical proof to match the digital ghost," Hawke said. "The ledger is the final key. I'm going to the roof. I'll give them the chase they want. You stay here. Use the drive. It has a preset upload to every major news outlet in the country. It just needs the verification code on the last page of that book." "Why help us?" Hannah gasped, coughing into her sleeve. Hawke paused at the door, the ledger tucked under his arm. He looked at the jagged scar on his hand, then back at Zack. "Because the riddle is finally solved, Mr. Baxter. And I'm tired of being the only one who knows the answer." With a sudden burst of speed, Hawke vanished into the stairwell. Seconds later, the sound of heavy boots and muffled shouts erupted from below. The cleaners were taking the bait. They were following the man with the book.
Zack scrambled for the USB drive.
He crawled to the computer, his hands shaking as he jammed the silver stick into the port. A window popped up. "Upload pending. Enter verification key." "The last page," Zack shouted. "Hannah, did you see the code?" Hannah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't get that far." Hawke took the book. Zack froze. He looked at the screen. Then he remembered. The first riddle. The one from the library. 3 turns for the silver, none for the soul. "The numbers," Zack breathed. The gold wasn't the answer. The numbers in the riddles were the code. He began to type. 3 to 0, 8 to 0, 1 to 9, 4 to 6. The progress bar appeared. 0%, 5%, 12%. From the roof above, a single gunshot rang out. Then, the sound of a heavy body hitting the gravel. "Zack," Hannah whispered, her eyes wide. "Keep it going," Zack said, his jaw set. "Don't look away. Make it count. 98%, 99%, 100%. Upload complete. The truth is out." Zack slumped back against the desk. Below in the street, the sirens were getting louder, but for the first time, they sounded like they were coming for the right people. He looked at the empty window where the drone had been. The hunt was over. Zack Baxter, the boy who liked secrets, had just told the biggest one in the world. Chapter 7. Epilogue, The Aftermath. The silence that followed the upload complete notification was louder than any gunshot. For a few seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the digital floodgates broke. In newsrooms across the country, pings began to fire like a volley of arrows. On social media, the leaked ledger, paired with Ronan Hawke's digital evidence, ignited a firestorm that no bank, no matter how powerful, could extinguish. "It's done," Hannah whispered. She was leaning against the cold metal of a drafting table, her face illuminated by the blue light of the monitor. "Zack, look." On the screen, the front page of every major news site was shifting. Union National exposed. The 1946 ghost heist, a corporate lie. Missing gold found beneath university library. Zack didn't feel the rush of victory he had expected. He felt empty, cold, and desperately tired. He walked to the shattered window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city of Ravenna glistening like a dark jewel. Down in the street, the black SUVs of the cleaners were frantically reversing, their mission of secrecy now a public suicide note. Director Vance was nowhere to be seen. She had likely vanished into the shadows the moment the first tweet hit the wire. "We have to go down there," Zack said, his voice a ghost of itself. "The real police will be here in minutes. We need to be the first ones they talk to." They descended the stairs of the tannery building slowly, their legs feeling like lead. When they stepped out into the alley, the morning light was just beginning to gray the sky. They found Ronan Hawke at the base of the fire escape. He was sitting on a rusted dumpster, his charcoal coat soaked through, his back against the brick wall. His silver-headed cane lay in 2 pieces on the pavement. He wasn't dead, but he was finished. He had a gunshot wound in his shoulder, and his breathing was shallow, a wet rattle in his chest. The black ledger, the object of 80 years of blood and obsession, lay open in his lap, its pages fluttering in the morning breeze. "You stayed," Hawke wheezed, looking up as Zack and Hannah approached. He didn't look like a predator anymore. He looked like a man who had finally put down a weight he'd been carrying since birth. "The upload worked, Ronan," Zack said, kneeling beside him. "The truth is everywhere." Hawke gave a small, grim smile. He reached out with his scarred hand and patted the ledger. "My grandfather, he wasn't a thief, Mr. Baxter. He was a witness. That's why they broke him. They couldn't have a witness." "They can't break the world," Hannah said, her voice steady. "Not anymore." In the distance, the real sirens, the high-pitched, wailing sirens of the city police and the FBI, were closing in from all directions. The university district was being cordoned off. Hawke looked at Zack, his eyes clouded but sharp with one final thought. "The gold in the basement, it's just metal, Zack. The real treasure was the key. You found it. You solved the final riddle." He handed the ledger to Zack. "Keep it. History shouldn't be buried. It should be taught." As the first police cruisers skidded to a halt at the end of the alley, Ronan Hawke closed his eyes. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to fight. He simply sat there in the gray light of a new world, a ghost finally finding peace. 2 months later, the Oak Haven University Library, formerly the Ravenna University Library, was undergoing a massive renovation. The sublevel D bunker had been turned into a museum, a permanent exhibit dedicated to the 1946 heist and the corruption that followed. The Union National Bank had collapsed within 48 hours of the leak, its directors arrested in a global dragnet. Zack Baxter stood in the West Wing, looking at the marble bust of Milton. The blind poet was still there, but the hole behind him had been filled. Thinking about another hunt?
Zack turned.
Hannah was standing there, a stack of books in her arms. She looked different. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. They were local heroes, though they both avoided the spotlight as much as possible. "No," Zack said, smiling. "I think I've had enough riddles for one lifetime." "That's a shame," Hannah said, stepping closer. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, heavy envelope. It was addressed to Zack, with no return address. The postmark was from a small town in the Swiss Alps. Zack opened it. Inside was a single piece of copper plating. It was identical to the one they had found in the graveyard, but the handwriting was fresh. The gold was the weight, the ledger was the light. But some secrets still sleep in the middle of the night. If you're looking for answers, look for the clockmaker's son. The game, Mr. Baxter, has only just begun. Zack looked at the copper plate, then at the empty alleyway visible through the library window. In the distance, a man in a long, dark coat was walking away, leaning on a brand-new silver cane. Zack looked at Hannah. She sighed, but a small, adventurous spark lit up her eyes. "So," she asked, "are we going to stay out? Or are we going back in?" Zack looked at the copper plate one last time. He felt the familiar thrill, the electric hum of a mystery waiting to be solved. He tucked the plate into his pocket and grabbed his bag. "Let's go see about a clockmaker," Zack said. They walked out of the library together, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind them, not like a casket this time, but like the start of a new chapter.
Thank you for listening to Stay Out, a Shiver Audiobooks production. We've traveled a long way together, from the dust-choked archives of Ravenna University to the fog-shrouded graves of the Weeping Angel, and finally into the iron heart of Sublevel Vault, where the fate of a legacy was decided in a single, desperate moment. Zack's journey reminds us that in a world governed by corporate power and carefully curated lies, the most powerful thing we still possess is our refusal to look away from the truth. The 80-year silence has been broken, the vault has been emptied of its shadows, and the history we were never meant to know has finally fought its way back into the light. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please consider leaving a like and sharing the video. It's the best way to help our channel grow and ensures we can keep bringing these high-stakes, cinematic mysteries to life. A massive thank you to our subscribers. You are the keepers of truth that keep this signal alive. Without your support, stories like this will remain buried in forgotten dust of the stacks. Before you go, let us know in the comments. If you found a riddle that promised a fortune but threatened your life, would you have the courage to turn the first page? Or would you choose to stay out? Is the truth worth uncovering at any cost? Until the next record is unsealed. Stay alert, stay curious, and keep reading between the lines.